just facilitating this really wonderful discussion. Thank you very much.
And my name is Derek Aiken. I work in the Office of Government Relations here at Roundtables.
That's it. All right, are we ready to go? Okay. Cal, did you want to say anything or introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So just going around the circle, there were a couple. I noticed most folks are leaders on their campuses. Some folks. One gentleman said he literally started organizing from day one. Student body presidents, other young leaders. I guess the thing that you all should know, just sort of as a takeaway, is that the intention of doing things like this is that it should be part of an ongoing conversation. Now, obviously, capacity, I'm sure on your end as well as ours, believe it or not, is fairly limited. Every year, Congress decides the budget of the White House, and they always decide it much lower than what the president would ask for. So the end result is that there's only one of us in each of these departments or in each of these desks that does outreach on a particular issue. And I mentioned the challenge related to doing youth outreach is that there's no advocacy counterpart in Washington, or no singular strong advocacy counterpart. But we do have a nice team of about 12 folks that work in the Office of Public Engagement with us, and each of those individuals tackles at least one or two issues. So I mentioned all of the community issues, so LGBT, African American, Latino, Asian American, Irish American, Italian American, etc. Also any of the issue-based constituency groups, so energy and environment, immigration, housing, business. There's somebody that covers all of those issues as well. The closest way that we kind of keep in touch with folks, we do a lot of listening with roundtables like this one, but because of the capacity, obviously a very huge country, a lot of folks that have a broad range of issues. The country is certainly getting more and more polarized in terms of the advocacy sometimes. So talking to a group of folks from San Francisco may be very different than talking to a group of folks from Chicago versus Alabama versus New Jersey. So one of the things that we try and do is, given the fact that we don't always have the time to take a full hour like this, we try and set up conference calls and web chats so that folks can hear from some of the senior administration officials. We recently had a great web chat with the EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson on EPA regulations and coal. Did one with Secretary Salazar. Secretary Clinton does these things from time to time. So if you all want to sign up for the youth newsletter, I'm going to add you to that once I get your sign-in sheets back. But also, if there's something that that is California statewide that you would like us to host, let's say you're doing one of your advocacy conference calls and you've got a couple thousand people that you push it out to, we can get an administration speaker, either myself or someone else from our office, who can hop on and maybe give an update from on what the president's position is on issue X or Y, if you all think that's helpful to you. So just keep that in mind as we all move forward. But Aaron, I'll turn it back over to you, however you all wanted to steer the conversation. We're mostly here to listen as well.
Okay, thank you. All right, so you guys want to jump in and start?
Go for it.
So I think like our first issue that we were talking about with the educational budget and its prioritization of funds, how did we talked about what we wanted to do, so that's our solution.
I hope can you hear all of us?
Yep.
Okay, you heard him? Because it's on.
I did.
Okay. So who wants to touch on the first one? How about maybe Andrew, because you kind of talked a lot about this.
Okay. Well, right now what we're trying to do also is just try and kind of get a bearing on the situation. With the budget cuts, like economic burdens affecting the colleges, what we have is federally, the funding that we get federally, we're competing with war, and we're also in the states we're competing with prisons. And in our own administration in the school, we kind of feel as though it's a little bit bloated. I mean, the thing is, they haven't gotten really that many cuts to the administration themselves, and to a certain degree, they've actually gotten more money during the times that we've gotten cuts to our teachers and lecturers. So, our question right now is, what can the federal government do to support state-run schools?
That's a very good question. So I can, and with all these questions, I would imagine, especially if you're talking about education or the prison system or basically any of the ways that money is being allocated, there's always well, not always, but oftentimes a pretty big disparity between what the federal government, particularly the White House, has jurisdiction over, what state governments have jurisdiction over, and then what either local school boards or campuses themselves choose to do with some of the money that's passed along. I can't speak to the latter two, obviously, but I can certainly share with you the president's view on this. I think we're in agreement here that you're talking about a budget that's oftentimes incredibly bloated, especially if you're talking about a couple of the areas that the president was trying to sort of revamp with his 2012 budget proposal. Namely, you alluded to a war. We're talking about the Iraq War that the president has started bringing our friends back home from there. Obviously, that's one of the big things that he campaigned on. He was against the war from the very beginning. And there will be not a negligible, but quite a bit of a cost savings when that finally comes to a close. But if you look at the overall Pentagon budget and you see the president's 2012 proposal, he's made significant cuts in some of the wasteful spending on the Pentagon side. What I would pay attention to, especially if you're getting an understanding of how that might affect other budgets, U.S. government obviously spends more money than we take in. That's why we're in this particular crisis. If you look at the Pentagon budget, if you look at some of the areas in which the president's proposed cuts, a lot of them are cuts that the Pentagon also wants. So there are things like, bloated budgets that the Pentagon doesn't even think are necessary, but particular members of Congress are strongly trying to push for those budgets to remain there because of a particular plant that might be in their district, producing a fighter jet, for example, that neither the Pentagon nor the White House believes that we need. Service members don't believe that we actually need them. So it's a very complicated situation when you're looking at what the pretty dramatic cuts that the president's proposing, and then you look at what the folks who actually set the budget agenda, which is, of course, our friends on Capitol Hill in Congress, you get a really strong sense of where the numbers are skewed. The president has made pretty dramatic cuts in the Pentagon budget. He's also increased pretty dramatically a lot of our education funding. But in answering the question whether or not that's actually going to be passed on to folks with the final budget, that answer unfortunately doesn't lie with us. And because of something called the Hatch Act, I obviously can't. Aaron, you probably know more about this and can shed some light for folks who don't know, but White House staff can't ever tell anybody, nor would we ever, to go lobby members of Congress. We're legally prohibited to do so because there is a legal separation between the executive branch and the legislative branch. So I can speak to the president's budget, which is very clear that he wants to continue to make more investments in education. The other thing that I would point to, two things. To give it a little more context on the federal side, student financial aid reform was something that President Obama accomplished right after healthcare reform, and it's something that got very little attention in the press. Basically, what financial aid reform did, and this goes back to bloated budgets, and someone mentioned the privatization of education. What used to happen is the federal government would loan out money to big banks. Big banks would then mark up the money considerably and loaned out to all of you in the form of student loans. What financial aid reform did was it got rid of the middleman in student lending. So what happens now is the federal government can loan money directly to young people. So there's more money in the pool, it's at a much lower rate, and it reaches out to many more individuals than would have otherwise had an opportunity. This was all done, through legislative action, so I don't have the list in front of me, but if you're curious who in the country or in California supported the legislation and who was opposed to it, I would urge you to go and look it up. It's all a public record. The other component that is equally nuanced, or perhaps more nuanced, is the American Opportunity Tax Credit. Do you guys know what that is?
Some of us do, some of us don't.
No. All right, so AOTC, or the American Opportunity Tax Credit, probably, by the way, these are the worst names ever for something that affects young people because it just doesn't sound like it's going to affect young people. But the American Opportunity Tax Credit is a $2,500 tax credit that every young person gets if they're going to college. It's something that the president fought very hard for. It's something that he campaigned on, and it's something that he won fairly early on in his administration. The reason that is so significant is, if you remember, probably 6 or 8 months ago, there was a big negotiation on taxes. And the big conversation was, why did President Obama compromise on tax breaks for the wealthy? He is very firm about the notion that he wants to make sure that the wealthiest Americans pay their fair share in taxes. They're not currently paying their fair share in taxes because of the Bush administration's tax cuts that were extended. The president was forced to extend those in a compromise recently. One of the reasons that he had to do that, or that he had to make that tough decision, was when he went to the table with the Republicans and with Speaker Boehner. One of the first things that they put on the table, that they said, Mr. President, here's what we want to get rid of, was the American Opportunity Tax Credit. So they wanted to get rid of all of you getting an extra $2,500 tax break in order to go to school. And that was a non-starter for the president. So he basically said, that's not happening. If that's the first thing you're putting on the table, then we're done. But in a very complicated and protracted series of negotiations, it became clear that the Republican caucus supported getting rid of this $2,500 tax break for all of you to go to school. And so that was one of the several reasons that led to the president having to make a compromise on something that they wanted in order to get something that he wanted for young people. So the reason that's very significant is when you're moving into now 2012 and in about a year and a half when you see that conversation revisited, it's important to keep that in mind as you're dealing with the state level or the local level budget cuts, because the folks who represent you here in D.C. will also have a say in whether that $2,500 is still in your pockets or not.
I don't know that we would need the $2,500.
Somebody have a hand up?
Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I don't know that we would need the $2,500 tax credit if the tax cuts were allowed to expire. And Nadia quoted a statistic earlier. What can you say
So
again?
basically, if we had one statistic that we discussed in my educational research program that we had back in the day was that all the tax cuts that Bush gave, if we just for 1 year took the money of the tax cuts and gave it to education, it would fund education for 5 years. So in looking at in looking at that $2,500, that's nothing compared to the tax cuts that the rich are getting, and in turn how it's affecting our educational system as well as social programs, because we actually need that money that's been drained from our treasury. So that's our issue. There's absolutely no disagreement here. The thing that, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. No, it's fine. You didn't interrupt me. I was done. There's no disagreement on that here. I think that there are two challenges, right? If you're looking at how budgets are allocated, there's the Office of Management and Budget here at the White House that decides the president's budget. You know, they take into account what the president wants to do. In 2012, he had to make pretty significant cuts. Rather than bludgeoning programs to death, what he did was, in addition to all the tax pieces going through on the budgetary items, and not just cutting budgets overall, but looking at which ones work that we scale up, like education, and which ones may not have worked that we scale down or eliminate on a line item, not just on an agency level. But what you're talking about is absolutely right? If we had the capacity to just reallocate funds at large, then we would probably do that. Thankfully, we don't live in a dictatorship, so the president can't necessarily do that himself, which is why the aspect of who are the folks that represent us elsewhere in the government, where are the votes going to come from for legislation that does something like that. And I would urge you guys, if you have guidance on that for us specifically, let us know, because it's something that the president's hands are tied on in terms of what he can or can't do.
Sorry.
I can't see hands that well, so if you guys want to call on yourselves, go for it.